is my desire to have us think through the doctrine of the knowledge of God. What is it to know God? And in thinking about that, I feel a burden to try to do so with something of the texture in which the Bible does it. The Bible reveals God in certain ways, and while it's not inappropriate to abstract that and look at it from different angles, I think it is also good to try to see the context in which God reveals himself. The single book that I would look at in the Old Testament especially that reveals God would be the book of Exodus. I think the basic theme of the book of Exodus is the knowledge of God. Who is the Lord? Pharaoh asked that question and God answers. Israel asked that question and God answers. The repeated idea is what is it to know the Lord? And so I would like to focus my own thoughts this evening on an introduction to the book of Exodus by looking at Exodus chapter 1. The knowledge of God does not come in the Bible through a philosopher. It doesn't even come through a theologian who happens to be studying the great ancient scriptures. It comes from a people that are under severe oppression. And their great leader his life is threatened. He barely escapes birth and childhood. He is raised in the enemy's own palace and camp. He stands up to represent his people and commits murder and runs for his life, spends 40 years in the desert, and then God reveals himself to him. And so I'd like to have us set the context of how God is known. And I think something of the significance of the knowledge of God is seen in the way that God has revealed himself through the history of Israel, and how his knowledge is very much related to their own experience of God. Our own day is living on the backs of a pretty long and great tradition of thinking about God. Some people, our culture has something of the cut flower syndrome. A couple weeks ago, Lisa celebrated a birthday, and for her birthday, I bought her cut flowers. Granted, her brother bought her better cut flowers than I did, but I did the best I could, and I'm glad to be bested by a brother-in-law. So anyway, cut flowers are beautiful for about 8 days, and then their nature of being cut catches up with them and they die. So our culture still has a remnant of beauty, and not an insubstantial one. Many people have found it odd that the enemies of Christianity use Christian thinking to argue. That they are basing many of their criticisms upon ideas like love and compassion for the weak and the redemption, all these ideas that come out of the Christian story that are now themes. But what is the basis of those? Where are those things rooted? Where is the idea of human dignity? What's the theological, what's the foundation for those things? It looks like cut flowers, that we've cut off the roots and we're still seeing some produce of that, but you wonder how long it can continue with various pressures in the world. And you can even see in the self-contradictory nature of many of the stances our world takes from. The Bible roots human dignity in the knowledge of God. That man ought to be esteemed because God is esteemed. And man's mistreatment of other men is wrong because of our position before God. If you will, look with me at Exodus chapter 1. I'd like to go ahead and read the chapter and reflect upon something of its significance as it begins to pave the way for one of the great revelations of God in the Scriptures, of how God reveals himself to Israel through Moses. And we'll look at that in coming weeks. But something of the background, the foundation of how God, or when, and in what context God reveals himself in the book of Exodus by looking at chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and it happen, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, the name of the other Puah. And he said, When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing, and saved the male children alive? But the midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So the context for the revelation of the knowledge of God in the book of Exodus is rooted in oppression. The story begins with Israel in bondage and severe mistreatment by Pharaoh and his regime. That's the context by which God has his greatest, mightiest, most clear revealing of his power, his character, his plan. So let's think through kind of what's going on here in this chapter. So the chapter begins assuming you know Genesis. In many respects, Exodus is the most important book in the Bible, but it itself is also rooted in Genesis. So Genesis is extremely important too, as it helps us understand where the context of Exodus. Exodus is kind of is the birth of Israel. It's the birth of this great nation, but it has roots in the patriarchs in the prior era. In Genesis, and this begins by acknowledging this family, the children of Jacob, who is now renamed Israel. These sons of Israel are now the tribes, and they are in the land of Egypt, both under oppression but also flourishing. So we might think back, okay, where does this story come from? And the story is rooted in the book of Genesis theme about God has chosen this family we call Israel, God calls Israel, to redeem them and to reveal the knowledge of God. God has chosen Israel to hold a special place in world history, in the conduct of the world. God's knowledge doesn't come just abstractly through thinkers and philosophers, but through a family, and a family rooted in historical experiences, in the rigors of life, in the uncertainties of life. God's knowledge comes through this family of Abraham. And it came from this calling or this choosing of Abraham by God, that Abraham's family would produce a great nation family, a family nation, through whom he would bless the world. If you look back just briefly at a couple passages from Genesis, a repeated theme, in fact, you could safely argue perhaps the theme of the book of Genesis is first revealed in Genesis chapter 12. Look at Genesis 12 and verse number 1. Genesis 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That theme is repeated throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, at least, 4 or 5 times, and then other times it's not directly quoted, but it's assumed that this is the key story. It kind of shapes the whole story of Genesis. Sometimes there's a famine. We're wondering, how is this family going to be the blessing of all nations? They're in jeopardy. Other times it's the self-fighting that they are splitting apart, and then of course they end up going to Egypt, and you're like, where is this? How is this going to happen? So it's rooted in God's calling of Abraham's family that they are going to be blessed, great nation, but they're also going to be the source of all the nations being blessed. All the world is going to be blessed through this particular family. So our interests are in them. And by the way, I think if you just kind of step back and look at the big picture, it's true. Some of our greatest traditions, some of our most established principles come from this family. This book that God uses them to produce has been a huge blessing to the world. Just the Bible itself has been a tremendous blessing that shaped especially the Western world, and in some respects, every part of the world through its influence. A very remarkable book that came through this family and the story of this family. And who cannot but sympathize with this story of this family in bondage? We're concerned about people in bondage. We should be concerned about people in bondage. And God chooses this tiny group of people, rooted in one man. God stakes his revelation upon the livelihood of one man, and when the story starts, he's 75 years old and he doesn't even have any children yet. What kind of human promise would this be? Who would have thought that this man is going to become something great? You would think his days are already past. You would think, God, if you're going to choose a hope of the world, at least pick somebody with good prospects. And of course, that's part of the knowledge of God, is that God does not choose to use good human prospects, not that he never does, but he loves to choose those that need him. Abraham comes out of Ur of the Chaldees, the greatest nation state at the time, the city-state at the time, and it's a place where the history of the world has been rooted, quite honestly, in oppression. The early days of man are a sordid history of oppression, of violence, of the strong oppressing the weak. Part of the significance of the Tower of Babel, of course, part of it is religious, that these people are seeking to find some other way to worship than God. But the other part of it is that these leaders of Babel and Nimrod and his ilk are oppressing others. They are becoming great by stepping on the backs and upon the work, the toil of many others. And Abraham's called out of this place. And not only called out of that place, but he's called out of the religions that ran that place. So people tend to use religion in order to get their way. They design religions, they imagine religions that make themselves seem greater. And those are the religions, the idolatrous religions of that world. And God calls Abram out of those places. And part of what God needs to do is to rid Abraham and his family of the idolatry that they've been steeped in. They've been raised in a world where idols and idol worship is the way the world is run. And Abraham's called out of that. If you will, look with me at Joshua chapter 24, where we hear something of the way Joshua looked at the history of his own people, what their background was, and what his perspective on their origins. What were their origins, and how did Joshua and how does he teach Israel to think about themselves? Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2 says, "And Joshua said to all the people, 'Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river, Euphrates. In old times they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac.'" So basically, Joshua says, here's our people. We were rooted, we were steeped in all the idolatrous worship of those people. And now God's saying, I want to make a new people, and I'm drawing you out of there to a different land, and you are going to leave those other gods, that other religion, across the river, and you're going to come to a new place. Of course, people didn't get that message. They did worship the gods of the nations, and Joshua is bringing this up to remind them, you're defying what God's trying to do. God's trying to make a people rooted in the knowledge of him. And so he challenges them in verse 14, Joshua 24:14. Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So the people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. So we agree with your interpretation of history. The point of Israel is to be separated from all the false worship of the land, to come out and to worship the true God, and to build a family nation state upon this idea of a new way of thinking about, well, not really new, but an old way, but a true way, and I guess renewed way of thinking about what God is doing in the world. So the knowledge of God is going to be a new knowledge that throws away idols, but also throws away oppression. Israel is not to be an oppressive people. Their knowledge is going to lead them into a new kind of way of thinking about how civilization can work, not rooted in slavery, not rooted in oppression and stepping on the backs of others, but in a knowledge of God that changes the way we think about human culture and civilization. So as I mentioned, God chooses a family who is constantly struggling with impotence. Abraham's too old to have children. How is he going to have a child? How is he going to be a father of many nations when he can't even have any children? So part of the story of Israel is he chooses a people who are pretty weak in number, here weak in potency. There's a number of the patriarchs who are, it's amazing they are patriarchs. Patriarch means father, because they seem to never be able to have any children, or the wives can't have children, and so they're struggling with impotence. They maybe symbolize human futility, human frustration that is not naturally gifted and powerful. They're going to have to depend upon God, and so there's one intervention of God after another that brings a miraculous birth even in old age. So God chooses a family that has to depend upon him. Abraham is called to just trust God, and then his children and grandchildren as well to trust God. He also chose this family who in Exodus 1 are in bondage, who display the all too typical family insecurities. Humans are insecure. They fear. They think the worst. They're suspicious. And their suspicions lead them to mistreat each other. Their suspicions lead them to try to, I'll get you first, before you get me. And so this family is not a model family of what we might hope God's people would be. They are full of insecurities. They have jealousies and all the mistreatments that come from those kind of things. And I think the most reasonable explanation of this is God is showing that he is a God of mercy. He's a God who is not working with perfect people. In fact, he's working with a very flawed people. And the whole point of the knowledge of God is going to take a people full of all the human failings and all the human misconducts, and is going to work with his people to redeem them out of them. In fact, one of the reasons that they are in Egypt is because of their, both God's blessing and their own misconduct of how they treated one of their own brothers. So God is gracious, but even God's grace becomes part of the problem. God's grace brought additional turmoil because this idea of God choosing people caused other people to resent it. Who are you to be chosen? Who do you think you are? And I think Joseph basically symbolizes Israel as a whole, in that Joseph is chosen and it goes to his head. He gets a coat of many colors. He has these dreams that his mother and father and brothers are going to bow and worship him, and it seems to be something that becomes an element of pride, that he likes this idea. And of course, that produces all the more resentment in his brothers, and their mistreatment of him is somewhat understandable, not that it's right, but who can handle the chosen one? You know, this idea of somebody being chosen, of course, that's been Israel's lot. Who do these people think they are, that they are the chosen people? How dare they, think they are better than anyone else? And so Joseph's experience kind of mirrors the experience of Israel, that God's grace brings a kind of a difficulty. It can result in pride, self-trust, and self-exaltation, but also the lesson surely is that we might learn to trust God and his plan. Sometimes God uses people in ways that are favored. People that seem to just be blessed. Some people that have a knack. Some people that just seem God takes them and he showers them with blessing, and we think that's not fair. Of course, our problem ultimately was God, but we tend to take it out on other people who are the chosen, the ones that are particularly blessed. So I believe God's trying to teach us that the knowledge of him is he's sovereign with his grace. He can do with it as he pleases. We should not boast as the chosen one, and we should not be jealous of those who are more blessed than ourselves. To receive God's blessing with trust and humility, and to, if we see others, to not have resentment and fighting over it. So Israel's history is kind of wrapped up in the struggle of being God's blessed and chosen people. It's not everything that we might wish it was by an easy road. Well, now I turn your attention back to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus reminded us of the book of Genesis and something of the history and God's choice and blessing and why they are in Egypt, and now they are there and they are being oppressed. So in Exodus chapter 1, there's a new king, verse 8, over Egypt who did not know Joseph and none of the blessings that he provided for Egypt and his own people. And now this new king, a Pharaoh, sees Israel as a problem. Verse 9, he said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So Pharaoh is an oppressor. He has might, and he doesn't care about God. He doesn't think about God. He doesn't acknowledge God. Later, he boasts, "Who is the Lord? I don't know the Lord that I should submit to him." Not sure he's saying, "I've never heard of God." I believe what he's saying is, "I'm not submitting to God. I don't acknowledge your God. That's not a God I'm going to give way to." And it's rooted here. This leads to him being free to oppress the people. We might just back up and think about, again, Genesis for a little bit more. Genesis taught us something about work. Genesis 1 records that God created the heavens and the earth, and he made all these things, and he called them good. And he set man as the ruler over these things. He called them good, and he said the world would give way to their leadership, to their work, to their labor. And it would be fruitful, and it would grow. And work here is an obligation, but a blessed obligation. It's one in which man would find significance in being Lord over the creation. God didn't make labor in order to oppress man, but to give him the dignity of being a co-creator and a co-holder horticulturist with God and a husband of animals, husbandry of animals, and it causes to grow. And it's a world that's good, and labor is good. And God created man in order to multiply and fill the earth with this goodness and tend the earth and to care for it. And it's a scene where work is not man's enemy, but it's something good for him to do. It's an ally to his own dignity. So God created man to work and to rule and enjoy the fruit of all of his labors. The idea is that it's going to be a pleasant and a good thing that man is called to be doing. However, something greater than work came, is that after God created, on the seventh day, he rested. And the thought is that there's something higher than the sixth day, something higher than man, and something higher than work. There's something more important than man's labor, and that is God's resting. And man is called to join in this creative work of God, but also to join in his rest, and to find his identity not only in the creation, but as a greater than man in resting in God and enjoying God's presence. So we are to imagine in the garden God walking with the man and the woman and enjoying our rest with them, something higher than the work by which they were given. However, sin entered the world and alienated man from God, thrust him from God's presence, but also induced stubbornness into the world where it's no longer as cooperative, and also an oppression between men and other men. There are first children. There's murder committed between them as a sign of this violence, that some kind of alienation has happened between human relationships. So sin has damaged this natural work environment and created a less desirable, in some respects, undesirable. So as we think back now at Exodus, the record here of this repetition of bitterness, rigor, in verse number 13, we read about serve with rigor. And verse 14, made their lives bitter with hard bondage in all manner of service in the field. That is something that's obviously an unpleasant and undignified kind of work. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So work now is used as a way to oppress man. Or rather than being a gift and rather as being a place under God's authority, now work is being used as one person to dominate another, or one group of people to dominate another people. We note that one of the things that Pharaoh fears here is the people of Israel. That he's afraid of them, they're growing. God apparently is not named, but we assume that God is the one who is working and he's causing them to abundantly multiply. Verse number 7, the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and grew exceedingly. And this makes Pharaoh nervous. He thinks there's too many of them. He sees them as an alien people and as a problem to his rule. Even when he oppresses them, they still multiply, verse 12. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. So he needs to do more than make their lives miserable. He needs to start eliminating them. That scene, or that whole theme of Pharaoh's fear, reminds me of pre-Civil War America. When you read American history and you read about slavery, one of the things that was happening in America is that a lot of people knew slavery was wrong, and they felt bad about it. But they feared the slaves too much to free them. They were greatly intimidated by the slaves, and they thought, we have to keep them under oppression, or they're going to rise up and kill us, or they're going to side with our enemies. And so it kind of was like a self-growing thing, that the more they felt guilty, the more that the slaves felt oppressed, the more they feared them, and so it continued on and on. It required a horrible civil war to deal with such a huge human problem. Human life is a blessing. It is not something to be feared. It's not something to be thought this is some horrible thing, but something to delight in. Of course, nobody quite could have the courage to actually free them because of the way fear tends to work. So if you fear people, one of the things you can do is say that they're inferior. And so slavery produces racism, and we've had a whole history of when you subject somebody, you have to find some reason to make it tolerable, right? And so if you're going to suppress somebody, you better find some demeaning way to think about them. And so slavery produces racism, and racism produces continued slavery. They justify each other. So Pharaoh disregards the humanity of the Hebrews. He treats them like they are machines. He treats them like they are livestock. He has no concern for their thoughts, their feelings, their freedom, their dignity. He sees them not as image bearers of God. He sees them as objects for his own manipulation. And he does it because he has no fear of God. He has no regard for human life because he doesn't know God. And such is a world, at least potentially, that does not know God. He disregards the higher nature of man. We don't see this yet, but later we know it's true because Moses encounters it. He doesn't want Israel to worship God. He fears their worship of God, probably for the same reason that communism tends to fear open worship of God, is that if there's a higher authority than the government, then the government has to respond to that authority. And so there's always this nervousness in these regimes about the worship of God. So he disregards man's higher nature, devoted to the God that owns him, that created him, owns him, and to whom he owes allegiance alone. He's afraid of the knowledge of God. He doesn't want the people to know God. He might lose authority. He might lose his self-obsession with his own powers. And so he does all he can to make it so Israel can't worship, that the people of his land can only worship according to the gods that serve Pharaoh's needs. I expect if we unpack all what's going on in our culture, our government is probably equally nervous about the worship of God, especially an element in our government that would like to control everything, that would like to manipulate everything, and finds that people with an independent mind, people with a sense that there's a higher authority will be trouble. And so the knowledge of God is a threat to those that want to rule by power, that want to rule by their own wisdom and not submit to the things of God. And so he has no regard for the sacredness of life. He hardly thinks twice about calling for the deaths of all the Hebrew boys. It's a political necessity. Sure, it'd be better if they were not a threat, but if they are, they can be eliminated. And so the lack of the knowledge of God produces a disregard for the sacredness of human life. So labor becomes oppressive when God's not acknowledged. You can kind of see the Ten Commandments kind of on the horizon here, or at least the need for the Ten Commandments on the horizon here. They're kind of coming here. Part of that whole thing is to cure some of the ills that are shown here. Labor becomes oppressive when God is not acknowledged. For example, when the worker is owned by another human being and God is not honored. We have one owner of our humanity, it's God. Men do not have the authority and the right to own another person, to say, you belong only to me. And so Pharaoh doesn't know God, so he thinks he owns the rights to, and his Egyptian owners, masters, can treat anybody the way they want because they own them, because God is not acknowledged. Labor is oppressive when it's unrewarded, when people have no benefit for themselves for the work that they do. They have no lot other than what their owner happens to want to give them. They have no rights to secure their own choices and freedom. So they are not rewarded, and therefore the burden is all the more oppressive. Labor is oppressive when it's unrelieved by rest. No days off, 7 days a week. As much as work they can get out of them, is only as little rest as they might need to get them productive without giving them strength to uprise. Labor is oppressive when God is not acknowledged and God commands rest. The fourth commandment, to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall do your work, on the seventh day you shall rest, you and your manservant and your maidservant. That you don't own them, God does. they have an obligation, they have a privilege, they have the freedom to stand before their God and to rest. And so labor is oppressive when it doesn't acknowledge the superior place of man's relationship to God and the service of God. And so the story continues. Even in the midst of this oppression of Pharaoh, God is raised up and honors a couple of women who stand out as examples of those that honor life. In verse 15, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God. The midwives knew God. They feared God. We can't do this thing that you want us to do. Human life is sacred before God. It's made in his image. We ought not to take human life. And so they, in a clever and interesting way, they find ways to keep these baby boys alive. The king's upset about this, and they somehow plow through his objection. And God blesses them. In verse 20, therefore God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. Some great Jewish traditions about what became of these women's families, of how God took these that treasured life. Now, of course, two things are happening here. One, they treasure life. Second, they're being used by God to redeem his people. And they are part of this specific plan. And so God is honoring these that are protecting human life. If we jump to the end of chapter 2, there's interesting intertwining of the story that we hear something of the redemption before we know God actually hears it. And we hear of what God's response is at the end of chapter 2. Exodus 2 in verse number 23. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. In other words, God's saying, I hear these cries, and I grieve. I see this bondage, and I get angry. I see what's going on, and my heart is with these people. Humans ought not to be treated this way. My people ought not to be treated this way. This is what I'm redeeming the world for and from. And so God's heart is now moved, and we're about to hear the story of what God's going to do. And what is God going to do? He's going to deliver Israel from bondage, but more significantly, he's going to reveal his name. He's going to say, this is not the knowledge of God. What's happened here is ignorance of God. And what the world needs is a view of who God is. And God, in delivering Israel from Egypt, is going to exalt the honor of his name, and it's also going to be the liberty of his people. Those two thoughts in the Bible, anyway, go together. The liberty of the people and the knowledge of God are tandem. They come together with each other, and that's the way the book of Exodus will proceed, is that it's going to be the context in which God reveals himself in the image, in his image bearers of Israel, and by extension, all image bearers who come to trust in this God. So the context of knowledge of God is the context of some of the most dear things to us. Our freedom and our dignity, the meaning of our work, how we ought to treat other people, how we ought to think about our nature as being more than just physical but spiritual, and rest being a part along with work. And so the knowledge of God comes with implications for how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, how we think about government, how we think about the needy, how we think about our obligation to the oppressed, how we think about the unborn, and our obligation to speak for those that cannot speak for themselves, to rescue those that are helpless, is that the knowledge of God is implemented in caring about his image bearers and reflecting him well. The knowledge of God is not only a private matter, of course it is, but it's also a public matter and ought to be honored with the way that we present ourselves to the needs of the oppressed, the afflicted, the kidnapped, the sex trafficking industry of our world, the abortion industry of our world, the degradation of human life in 1,000 different ways. If we say we know God, we say we care about these things because God says, when I know this, I acknowledge my people need to be delivered by the knowledge of God. Let's pray. Father, I do pray that we would know that you love human life. You want it to flourish. It was your design. You hate human bondage and the indignities of an ignorance of God and a using of power to one person or one group of people to oppress another. I pray that we might be a people who do know you, but also know you and what the knowledge of God implies for our responsibility for others, how we treat them, and how we let other people be treated. May we stand up for human life. May we give it dignity and grace. May we be your chosen people, not with arrogance, but with the humility of knowing it's only by your grace, and invite others to enjoy that grace as well. It's in Jesus' name we pray and ask for power to carry these things out. In his name we pray, amen. You are